So, I've stolen books before from lobbies of hotels and bed and breakfasts, and I thought this would be a good one. I didn't know anything about the author. I read the book, and I was really fascinated by the depth of the research. And I kind of got a little bit obsessed with Jeff Guinn and his works. I started reading all of his works of history. One of the things that I think Jeff does very well is that he takes topics that have a lot of popular culture resonance to them, or topics that have actually much has been written about in the past. But unfortunately, a lot of these topics are filled with innuendo, mythologies, misrepresentations, inaccuracies. He takes these topics and he exhaustively researches them, and he writes a definitive history that goes back and revises and goes back and clarifies. And so after reading his book on Bonnie and Clyde, I read one of his more recent books, Road to Jonestown, about Jim Jones. And I thought that the connections between Manson and Jonestown and Jim Jones were important to have a conversation about. So I reached out to Jeff Guinn for him to come out to Hayes and have a conversation with me. And here he is. Let's all welcome Jeff Guinn, author, to campus. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you very much. I noticed there's a little less enthusiasm in the back row from the students who've had to listen to me all afternoon. So there we go. A man who studies Pancho Villa is clearly a man to know.
Yes.
I do want to say before we get started how amazed I am at this school. You're doing some fine things here, and the students that I've met are pretty much amazing, and I want to be best friends with a lot of the different professors. We're talking music and we're talking politics. I had never really heard of this school until Jay called, and I've got to tell you, you have got some great programs going on. You deserve to be very proud of this institution.
Nice. A lively crowd here for a Monday. Well, Jeff, I think you touched on something right away. We've been having conversations all day with fellow faculty members about the late 1960s and the 70s in particular. And, first question I want to ask is, you're an accomplished author and historian, and you write about a wide variety of subjects. How do you choose what to write about? What kind of process do you go through in terms of picking the topic? And can you explain some of the initial process that's involved there?
I write books that interest me on subjects that I want to know more about. Almost all my books are about some aspect of American history. But they may not be on the topic that some readers expect. For instance, the Manson book and the Jim Jones book. I wanted to write about America in the 1960s. That's the time when I was in college, when the country seemed to be coming apart in some ways, where every day something dramatic was happening. Sometimes it was great, a man walks on the moon. Other times, the Vietnam War, the Kennedy and the King assassinations. It's a time when everything seemed possible, good and bad. And so I thought, to do a book about this, I needed to have a subject that most readers will have heard of, and you use that to build around. My Bonnie and Clyde book is about the Dust Bowl and growing up poor during the Depression. It just happens to use Bonnie and Clyde. The Last Gunfight, about the gunfight at the OK Corral, which wasn't a gunfight and didn't happen at the OK Corral, but everything else about it is just as you've read, was really about the expansion of the American frontier. So to write about the 1960s, what's something just about everybody has heard of that brings together all these different threads? Music in the 1960s has become more important as perhaps the way that most young people think ideas are communicated. Movies have changed dramatically. We used to go see movies about John Wayne. Suddenly the big movies are about Bonnie and Clyde, or The Graduate about a nerdy little guy named Benjamin. And they started talking in all the magazines about the anti-hero, how suddenly young people were interested in something away from the old swaggering six-gun sheriff who always saved the town. Politics. Richard Nixon was president, and he became president by running a campaign where he said, "Law and order shall prevail in America." And this was taken by a lot of voters as code, because we were having race riots in just about every major city. We were having marches against the Vietnam War. And the country was beginning to divide itself, with the older more conservative, the younger more liberal. All these things are happening. They aren't new. Things like this have happened throughout American history, because history is cyclical, and it's happening again today. But this is the 1960s. What happened in the 1960s, everybody knows about. It was then that one of my sons, thinking it was hysterically funny, told me that he had just seen an ad for a Charlie Manson ringtone for the cell phone. Manson thought of himself as the greatest musician in the history of the world. I have been in possession of some of the tapes that Charlie Manson made of himself singing and playing that he was trying to peddle to record producers. And I can tell you truthfully that Charlie has all the talent and ability of a 7th grade garage band where the kids have just started playing the instruments that day. And yet, for a couple dollars a month, any of you out there could have your Charlie Manson ringtone on your phone. Now, why you would want to listen to that crap is beyond me. And I thought, Manson. Here's Charlie Manson. He's a grubby little nobody out of West Virginia. And yet, for a while, he became one of the most famous men in the world. And he still remains pretty famous. So what is there about the 60s I can write about using Charlie Manson as sort of a mirror to reflect what's happening? Mm-hmm. That's how I picked him. And when I finished that book, I was tired of gore and mass murder. So naturally, I wrote about something else entirely different, Jim Jones and Jonestown. When I finished the Manson book, now I wanted to write about what happens to America after the late 60s. How does the country change? And this is a time when a generation of Americans was losing faith in institutions. It used to be back in the 50s, you were a good American and you respected your president and you went to church on Sunday and you wore a tie and coat to work. Mustache wouldn't have done it. And now, all of a sudden, it's popular not to trust the government. Church attendance goes down in America in the early 1970s by almost 20%. What's happening is people move away from institutions. And I thought about it for a long time. I decided in the 1970s, there's only two things everybody knows about. The first is Watergate. And I promise you, everything that could possibly be written about Watergate has been written. And the other thing was don't drink the Kool-Aid. Can I see a show of hands? How many people have heard of that saying, don't drink the Kool-Aid? How many of you have used the expression, don't drink the Kool-Aid? Is that a Charlie Manson ringtone on a phone in the back?
Sounds a little pleasant for Charlie.
So I decided I'd look into Jim Jones, who had obviously had these sheep-like followers who all killed themselves on command. And the first thing I found out was it wasn't Kool-Aid. They couldn't afford Kool-Aid in Jonestown. It was a cheap knockoff called Flavor Aid. And yet, this phrase has entered our lexicon, Kool-Aid. And the second thing I found out was that Jim Jones, this creep, this tyrant, this demagogue, who led over 900 people to their deaths, and though they did not line up peacefully to drink the Flavor Aid, there were guards with guns, and if you wouldn't drink the cup you were given, they would hold you down and inject you forcibly with it. This guy, this creep, this horror movie A-lister, had been one of the great leaders of the American civil rights movements in the 1950s. And today in Indianapolis, which was the first major city where he set his church, People's Temple, I have met aged black men and women who cry talking about him, not because of the terrible deaths in Guyana, but because of the wonderful things he did to save them. This same terrible man, over 3 years in Indianapolis, integrated one of the most segregated cities in America. He did this single-handedly, and now I have a book. What changed? What brought someone who had such a great beginning to such a terrible end? So the long answer is, in every era in our history, there are people or events that we remember. And we think at the time we're remembering them only because of the incident itself. But once we look, that's when we can see how politics, how culture, how economics come together periodically, and they create a situation where things happen that we will remember later. So every time I write a book, I learn a lot of things that I didn't know, and I also see how cyclical history is. Everything gets repeated, human nature doesn't change, which I suspect leads to your next question.
Well, yeah, I mean, I suspect this is one of the important roles that a historian should play, and how the public understands the present, right? It's often been said we cannot understand where we are here in the present without understanding how we got here, right? And that this is the value of history. I take it that this is one of the responsibilities, as well as one of the virtues, perhaps, of being a historian.
I had not understood this until I started writing and researching the books. I had heard that old hackneyed phrase, those who don't remember the past are doomed to relive it and so forth. But it is amazing how history repeats itself. Every issue we face today has come up before. And the reason it keeps coming back is we don't all work together sensibly to try to solve problems. We argue about them instead, and so they reoccur. When I was writing my book about Tombstone in the 1880s, these were the issues that divided America. Are you ready? Too much government versus too little government. The Republican Party wanted government involved in every last bit of anyone's lives. The Democrats said, keep government away from us. Let the people make their decisions. So if we flip-flop them, that's happening today. There was the issue of immigration. We can't have these foreign people coming into our country. They're going to take our jobs. They'll come in poor and they'll need us to support them. They're a drain on us. We don't want them. Build a wall. Keep them out. And yet you had another part of society saying, this is America. We're all immigrants. Let them come. We'll assimilate. There's room for everyone. We were having these arguments 130 years ago. Do any of them sound familiar to you today? And then, in that same time, there was the press. Could you trust the media or not? And the Democratic Party all across America was screaming that news was made up. It was manipulative. They're not telling the truth. It's propaganda. The Republicans were swearing a free press is important. We've got to give freedom of the press. We have to let newspapers write what they believe. Otherwise, the country is doomed. So we have different voices saying the things at different times, but it's all the same. As a historian, it's not my job to tell you what to think. It is my job to lay out the facts and let the readers make up their own minds, always understanding that it's not only possible but even probable that two well-meaning people can look at the same set of facts and come to entirely different conclusions. It doesn't mean somebody's evil. It doesn't mean someone's plotting against you. Doesn't mean they should be exterminated. It just means people have different viewpoints, and we're getting away from understanding that. So every book I write, I get more and more frustrated because these problems keep occurring. And every time they do, instead of all of us working together to come up with a common sense solution, we yell at each other. Hopefully, one of these days we'll learn. My book is just a drop in that flood that's needed.
I almost get the take that your view of being a historian is almost like an archaeologist excavating the cyclical nature of events and things that maybe are not perfectly cyclical, but that there is this surprising reoccurrence of things and situations. And when we look back into history with the lens of the present, we see remarkable similarities.
And that won't change because human nature doesn't change. Now, I'm 68 years old, and I can remember back at the dark ages, 1969, 1970, when I was in college, and my professors would bring in some old guy writer who would yap at us about boring stuff and think, God, this is taking a year off my life, and I can see some people out there suffering today. That's what I mean when I say everything's cyclical. I promise all of you young people, in 40 years, you will be out in front of college students, making them wish they were anywhere in the world but having to listen to you. You have that to look forward to. It doesn't change. Your parents, when they were your age, had more in common with you than you want to realize or your parents want to admit. That's why I love history, because the lessons are there if we want them.
Yeah. Let's launch a little bit into Manson first. I've got a couple of questions about the family and the Manson moment and its legacy, and then we'll move on to Jim Jones. I just want to reiterate that there's refreshments over there and some snacks as well. Feel free to stand up and go grab something to drink or eat. We're informal here.
I don't want to hear any bad jokes about is that Kool-Aid back there.
We've made that joke so many times already, and every time we say it's too soon. So March 1967. Charles Manson is 32 years old. He's released from prison in California. He's spent over half his life in prisons and other institutions. He's a violent career criminal. He's diagnosed as intensely antisocial. He's illiterate for the most part, low IQ. How is this career criminal and social outcast with no direction in his life able to become so influential to the counterculture era and so influential to American history in ways that you were talking about now at the Manson ringtone?
First of all, you have to remember who Charlie Manson is. Charlie Manson is a little scrawny guy. He's 5'3". He weighs maybe 120 pounds. When he hasn't been in prison, he's been working as the world's most inefficient pimp. He's in jail because he got the bright idea of stealing cars. The problem was, he didn't realize it's a federal crime when you steal a car and cross a state line. And Charlie ends up in prison in California. This is what I mean when I say moments in history converge. If Manson had been sent to prison even a year earlier, we would never have heard of him. But he goes to prison in the same year that the government decides we are going to change the nature of prison. Before, the whole idea was you sent somebody to the slammer and you wanted it to be a horrific experience. You wanted them to suffer. The idea being that if they suffered enough, they wouldn't commit any more crimes. But now suddenly it's going to be different. The purpose of prison is going to be to rehabilitate these unfortunate human beings. What we need to do, instead of making their lives miserable the whole time they're in there, is have classes try to teach them skills that will let them succeed in the real world. Manson is illiterate, but he's not stupid. All his life, Charlie Manson is a sponge. He can suck up information that can be useful to him. And in this prison, in California, they offer classes that the inmates can take. And the most popular class is Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. Now, if you're my age, you'll remember that there was a time in American history when these Carnegie books, how you could walk up to a complete stranger, say this, this, and this person will trust you and be your friend. Manson soaked it up. Dale Carnegie had these rules. He said, always remember them. The only way to make certain someone will agree with you is if you let the other person think your idea was really hers. Everybody wants to think, I was the one who came up with that. And so Manson, who never read a book and was proud of it, took the Dale Carnegie book back into his cell after class, and I know this because I found his cellmate, Phil Kaufman, who said Charlie would practice all these things, all these Dale Carnegie sayings. Later on, in researching the book, I met and spent a lot of time in California Women's Prison with Leslie Van Houten and Patricia Krenwinkel, two members of the Manson family, who were part of committing the Tate LaBianca murders. And they seemed like pretty bright people. What could Charlie Manson say to you that the first time you met him, you just wanted to go with him and be with him forever? And they both, I asked them this separately, by the way, and they both said the same thing. He could read my mind. He had these powers. It's like he knew what I was thinking. I said, well, what did he say? And they told me. Well, he said, da, 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 da. Reached into my notebook, pulled out the Dale Carnegie book, turned to chapter 9, and there it was, word for word. There was nothing original about Charlie Manson, but he had been in the right place at the right time for that training. Because of that, he knew how to approach drug-addled young people and convince them that they needed to give up everything they were doing and come with him. Now, anybody here in this section of the crowd, do you think you would fall for some scrawny little guy who's spouting Dale Carnegie stuff? No, you wouldn't. You'd be too smart, right? Couldn't fool you, not a bit. But just remember what Dale Carnegie said. Let the other person think the idea is his. So Charlie would start chatting with somebody, and he'd find out how they felt about something. Maybe it was the role of the church. Maybe it was whether the Beatles were great, just anything. And before those people knew it, they realized they were talking to someone who agreed with them about everything. You're just alike. And Charlie always approached people, this was his rule. If you want to get a follower, you don't want somebody who's broken. You just want them bruised a little bit. All his followers were estranged from their parents. And Charlie would tell them, look, you can be part of a real family that loves you for who you are. Forget your parents. Didn't work all the time, but it worked enough, and he got a following. Right place at the right time. He's in San Francisco, out on parole, summer of love, when every day there were Greyhound buses coming into San Francisco from all over the country. And in those buses, on an average day, were 300 teenagers who'd left home and wanted to come out and find some guru to tell them how they should live. If it had been a year later, it wouldn't have worked because Haight-Ashbury went right down the toilet into drugs and crime and everything else. But this one summer, they're coming wanting to hear this. And this one summer, Charlie Manson is there. And Charlie wants to be a rock star. He's convinced he's brilliant. And he's in California, and he's got his followers. And the American pop music culture in the last couple of years has moved from New York to Los Angeles. If that hadn't happened, Charlie's not in LA, but he goes there. And he meets the drummer of the Beach Boys, Dennis Wilson. He meets Terry Melcher, one of the big producers of pop music. And he falls in with their crowd. And Terry Melcher lives at a place on Cielo Drive that's up on the top of a mountain, and it looks wonderful. Melcher moves out, and he rents that house is rented to Roman Polanski, the music director, and Sharon Tate, the movie star. Do you see how coincidence works in? When the murders happen, you've got to remember we talked about time in America when every day brought something amazing, good or bad. Well, this story had it all. It had sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Sharon Tate was a B-movie actress at best, but her husband had just done a picture called Rosemary's Baby that was huge. 3 days after Sharon Tate's death, her old bad B-movies were being shown at theaters across America, that she was a great star. This happens in LA even when Charlie's finally arrested, timing again. The two Los Angeles daily newspapers are having a newspaper war. So they're fighting each other every day. Who can put the more lurid story of the Manson murders on the front page? And there's something else that's new in America. It's called the automated wire service, which means all across the country, any newspaper can run these stories, and everybody starts reading them. And it spreads around the world. And Charlie is a performer. The trial goes on for 8 months, and Charlie's performing every step of the way. And so the thing that we remember is Charlie Manson. If he'd gone to prison a year earlier, never would have gotten the Dale Carnegie course. Hadn't gotten Dale Carnegie, he couldn't have recruited followers. Hadn't been in San Francisco, he couldn't have found the followers. If he hadn't gone to LA. Can you imagine if Charlie Manson tried to pull this guru BS in New York City? Somebody would have stuck him on a pole in Harlem and left him there as a scarecrow. But out in California, that's where all these kids are coming. Tell us the secret of living. And Charlie talked about love and how life and death are the same thing. And if we kill these people, we're not really doing anything bad because there is no sin. It's just natural, so don't worry about it. And then Vincent Bugliosi, who's the prosecutor in Charlie's case, writes a book he calls Helter Skelter. Vince Bugliosi became a pretty good friend of mine over the course of my working on my book. I said, did you know that you were going to sell 9 million copies of that book and have it be the best-selling true crime book ever? And he said, yeah, sometimes I think I ought to share the royalty checks with Charlie. So one thing went upon another. That's how Charlie Manson got famous, this little scrubby guy from West Virginia. The best description I ever heard of him came from a guy named Greg Jacobs that knew him pretty well. He said, Charlie Manson is like a cancer cell. He never did anything that was good for anybody else, and he destroyed everything he touched. He was a thug and a waste of oxygen from the time he was born. And yet when he died, the story ran on the front page of every newspaper. Charlie always said he was going to be more famous than the Beatles, and in a sad, sick way, he just about succeeded. That's how Charlie Manson got to be part of our culture.
Yeah. Well, you just answered the next 3 questions. So I shouldn't have given you the questions beforehand, Jeff.
No, I promised the back row that I'd get done quick so they could get out of here. And they're looking at their watches, and they're a mean crew.
Yeah. No, this is, you did wonderfully there. One quick question here I'm interested in. What were the feelings like in LA broadly at this time? Can you discuss a little bit more of the environment and the atmosphere in Los Angeles? Were there broader counterculture voices that actually expressed support for the Manson family? Not just the Manson family adherents, because as many of you know, Manson had a following, the family, and his supporters were very vocal about their support. But were there broader counterculture support in the LA, Southern California area?
Well, that's a complicated question. Shall we take 20 minutes to answer it? I think not. We'll go the quick route. Los Angeles, up until 1967, was supposedly the happiest place on earth. It had Disneyland, it had the movies, La La Land, out in the sun. It was America at its most perfect. Then came the Watts race riots, some of the worst race riots in American history, and suddenly all across the country we're seeing pictures of parts of Los Angeles in flames. Because Los Angeles had always been a city where the poor were isolated from the rich. So there was that unrest. And Manson took advantage of that. He told his followers there was going to be a race war based on the prophecies of the Beatles. It was going to be called Helter Skelter, the blacks and the whites, and the blacks would overcome the whites. Charlie and his people would be spared by going out into the desert and hiding in a bottomless pit. They took a lot of drugs. And then the black people would not have the intelligence to be able to take care of themselves. They would have to turn to Charlie Manson and his followers who would rule the world. Yeah. But during the trial, it turned out that there were a lot of people who thought Charlie Manson was something special. There was a lot of student revolution at the time. And there was a group called SDS, Students for Democratic Society, where a lot of college students marched and wrote important position papers on how we're going to change everything. Made a lot of noise. And they had a group break off who thought, we don't want to talk, we want to fight. They called themselves the Weathermen. And the Weathermen thought Charlie Manson was an American hero. He stood up to the man. He left the man laying in a pool of blood, and that's what's going to have to happen to change America. They had a little sign to each other, and the sign was this. The second night of murders, when the LaBiancas were murdered, Lino LaBianca, the husband, was laying there dead, and one of his murderers took a fork 3 times and jabbed it into his abdomen and left it sticking there. The Weathermen would go around doing this to show their solidarity with Charlie Manson. There are, to this day, thousands of people convinced that Charlie was an American hero. Some of the rumors are that he worked for the CIA. No. Or that he was framed? No. That his was a voice of truth and they had to shut him up, so the authorities killed Tate LaBiancas and made it look like Charlie did it. You think that can't possibly be true. And yet when I'm writing this book and Charlie and I are in communication, and yes, I got letters from Charlie Manson at my house. They were a lot of fun. He would decorate the envelopes with daggers dripping blood, swastikas, spiders, and the words, always misspelled, Helter Skelter. After the 3rd one, the mailman didn't want to come up on my porch anymore. He would wait out on the lawn. But Charlie had followers. I went up to Corcoran State Prison in California where he was incarcerated, and there were pup tents around the main gate. I talked to the guards, and they said there's always some of Manson's followers camping there, hoping they'll let him out so he can come and take over their lives. And when the book came out, Charlie really was mad at me because I had found his sister and his cousin who'd never been interviewed before and was able to prove he'd made up a lot of stories about his childhood and so forth. So he got even by giving my contact information to his followers around the country. And I would go out on book tour, and some of them would come to see me. And some of them would email me. And some of them sent me letters, but at least they could spell helter skelter. So Charlie had his proponents then. To this day, he still has some. They have a website. I won't tell you where it is because you do not want to look at that garbage. Which means they're going to go find it, of course.
So I think that fits very nicely into the broader question here before we leave the Manson situation behind us. What are some of the key lessons? What are some of the big takeaways do you think that the public should draw from the figure of Manson, from the family, from these horrific murders that took place, and the cultural resonance, the historical resonance that still seems to be quite strong?
The first lesson is that whether we like to admit it or not, as a general public, we are entertained by tragedy. Always have been, always will be. And when you get all the media coverage, at a certain point, for a lot of people, it becomes entertainment rather than tragedy. There are exploitative Manson movies that are very popular still. Different documentaries. Manson is showbiz. Tragedy is showbiz. Maybe we should rethink that. Second part, a lot of my books deal with demagogues. And Charlie Manson was a demagogue. And if you want to tell if someone is or not, here are some rules you can apply, okay? The first thing a demagogue will do, as Charlie Manson did, as Jim Jones would do. Demagogues always announce there is this terrible crisis, and they'll take some social problem, but really exaggerate it, and say, I am the only one who can fix this. You have to follow me. I'm the only one who can do this. That's the first sign of a demagogue, when they take sole power for themselves. Second thing, as Manson did with his family, as Jim Jones did with People's Temple, you then try to initiate a mindset in your followers. You're either with us or you're the enemy. No middle ground. It's us against them. The third thing a demagogue will do is he or she will try to cut off their followers' connection with any other outside voices. They don't want you to hear arguments from somebody else. They only want you to agree with them. That's a demagogue. Fourth and final thing, they will try to prevent their followers watching TV or reading books or newspapers or anything that might give differing opinions. They can only be exposed to compliments to you, reasons that you are the leader, that you have to be followed. You see those signs, run. Manson had them, Jim Jones had them. And they're typical of demagogues throughout our history.
Yeah, so thinking about Jim Jones and switching over, a bridge question here. You know, he's such a very different figure from Charles Manson in so many ways. Where Manson was just a fraud, Jones had a real mission and a real ideology behind a committed and well-organized social movement. Can you talk a little bit about Jones's upbringing in Indiana, how he was able to find himself at the forefront of social justice?
Jim Jones is born in a little tiny farm town in rural Indiana. I know sometimes here at Hayes you may feel isolated. I guarantee you, if you go up to where Jim Jones was raised, you'd think you were in a highly populated area that spread hundreds of thousands of miles all the way around you. Little farm community. And everybody's goal growing up in this community was you wanted to be just like everybody else, except Jim Jones wasn't. This was a kid who, from the time he's 6 or so, is holding funerals for roadkill, who's climbing up on the roof of his house and telling his friends, "You're laughing. Have you held a funeral for roadkill?"
Well, my cat
Do you think, ma'am, that you are the only person who could possibly have this funeral for roadkill? Jim Jones was different from the beginning in a community where you weren't supposed to be different. In a lot of ways, he was a weird, annoying kid, but there was one thing. In Indiana, most people outside of the major cities never spoke to, much less even saw, a person of color. But in this one area of rural Indiana, there were 3 little areas, they can't be called towns, they were too small, of black farmers and their families who would come into the bigger white town on the weekends to go to the store to trade their crops in and so forth. And Jones was horrified that they were treated so badly. You got to wait till all the white people get taken care of. And even as a little boy, he'd go out of his way to talk to these folks. He'd invite them over to his house. He hated, and I mean hated, loathed racism in any form. As he grew up, as he grew older, he wanted to be important, he wanted to be somebody, and he saw religion as a way to do that. In this little town where he grew up, there were 5 churches. Not Catholic, because that was suspicious too, a little exotic. Certainly not a temple. But you had your Presbyterians, and you had your Nazarenes, and you had your Baptists, and you had your Seventh-day Adventists. And 5 churches in town, Jim Jones joined them all. And he would run from part of one service to another service on Sunday. Always looking, always listening. What do the ministers do at each of these places that make people pay attention? And then on Saturdays, he would put on his good clothes, and he would get on the bus, and he would ride to Richmond, Indiana, which was the big town nearby, population 30,000. And in Richmond, which was highly segregated, as most Indiana cities at the time were, Jim Jones would go down to the rail yard, and this is where the indigent black hobos would have to stand. They couldn't walk around town. They had to stand near the railroad tracks, and maybe if somebody had some work for a couple of them, they would call them. And Jim Jones would preach at the top of his lungs about how God loved everybody just the same. That it doesn't matter what color your skin is, how much money you have, what gender you are. Remember, this is a time when women supposedly should know their place. And here's Jim Jones saying that that's not right at all. God doesn't want you to keep women in diminished roles. God wants you to let women be equal. And sometimes he'd get beat up. He wasn't getting anything out of it besides a potential beating. So he was an odd kid. And yet there is this commitment, and it's an honest one. Manson made everything up. Jim Jones hated racism. He hated economic inequality. He hated misogyny. And he swore he was going to do something about it. And that's his background.
It's interesting to me that both Jones and Manson came from Middle America, not very far from each other. McMechen, West Virginia, Eastern Indiana. They both end up in California. Is there something unique to this time, the 1960s, something unique to this place, the American West Coast, where they're headed, that may explain something about Manson, Jones, and...
Everybody who had a dream wanted now to be in California. It was the place that anything was possible. Jones, though, started his ministry in Indianapolis. And his eventual goal was to get to California because you could only do so much in Indianapolis. But this is what he did. He started a little storefront church in the heart of the Indianapolis ghetto. In Indianapolis, the black population lived in one little tiny ghetto corner, crammed in together. And there were ditches filled with rancid water that ran all around it, and it was called Frog Island. And if you were black in Indianapolis, that's where you lived, and here is why. There are two different kinds of racism. One is the obvious in-your-face, whites-only signs over the drinking fountains. The Indianapolis City Council passed a law that said anybody of any race can live anywhere in the city, so long as the people who already live on that street will all agree that you can buy a house and live there. The white families all believed you let a black family move in, that lowers your property values. So no black people could buy a house near a decent school for their kids to go to. The hospitals were segregated. You couldn't go to the emergency ward of a white hospital if you were black and injured. The schools were effectively segregated because kids go to their neighborhood school. And the schools in Frog Island had textbooks that were as much as 60 years old. They had no playground equipment. Jim Jones starts People's Temple, his storefront church. All by himself, he volunteers to the city to head their Human Relations Council, which was always just a group in name only. So they could say, yeah, we're trying to work together. Within 3 years, Indianapolis is completely segregated. He fought the powers that be. He bargained with restaurant owners who would not seat blacks, saying, look, you need to do this. It's not only right, but you're going to have more customers. You're going to make more money. I've got all members of my black church. They'll come to have dinner here, and they'll come at quiet off hours, so they won't make any of your white customers go away. And look, you'll make all this. Do it. And they did. And he got those laws changed. And I have met aged black men and women in Indianapolis who tell me Jim Jones saved their lives. He started drug rehabilitation clinics for free. He had a cafe where if you were hungry, you would come and be fed, no questions asked. They took ghetto kids, People's Temple, and they sent them to college, paid for everything. So those kids who'd only get a street education otherwise had a chance in life. And some of those black kids became doctors and lawyers and architects, the first ones in all of Indiana. Jim Jones and his wife became the first white couple to adopt a black baby. And they had to fight the state legislature to do it. And if Jim Jones had been hit by a truck right there, he would be remembered today as one of the leaders of the civil rights movement in America, and deservedly so. And yet, 10 years later, this is the man who's in the jungles of Guyana, claiming he's God, that the American government is coming to kill all his people. And like all good socialists, you must line up now and drink this, because we're not committing suicide, we're making a revolutionary statement. And my book is how can that happen? What's happening in America that lets that happen? Charlie Manson was depressing to write about, and I hated, and I'll use these words carefully, not to offend anyone, but I hated the little son of a bitch. I couldn't stand him. I could not find one thing he had ever done in his life that was worthwhile. He hated me too, which was helpful. If he had liked me, I would have been worried. Jim Jones is a tragedy, not just for the other innocent people who died, but because this man, who clearly had so much ability as a leader, did what he did.
So Jones starts People's Temple in Indianapolis. It's a church and community It's one part religious and spiritual. It's one part socialist. And this kind of fusing together of a theocratic, a spiritualism, and we are a church, and fusing that with the political project of socialism seems very unique to me. But how would you describe that interplay between this religious component of the People's Temple and the political ideology of socialism? Was one more of a cover for the other? And I know I've read the book very carefully. I know that some leaders had opinions about that at the time. Was one more of a cover for the other, or were they both genuine belief systems held by the temple's adherents and leadership?
The best way to answer that is where Jim Jones got his inspiration, really, for People's Temple. Indiana was as white and Protestant as you could possibly be. But all across America, in the 1940s, in the 1950s, into the 1960s, before the civil rights legislation, for black people, church was two things. First, it was religion. And they would always talk, the ministers, of the promised land. That yes, things are unfair to us here in life, but we're going to be good Christians, we're going to follow the Bible, and someday the Lord will take us to the promised land. But the church for black memberships was also the social focal point. This is where, if you wanted to work towards getting playground equipment for the Frogs Island Elementary School, that you formed a delegation and sent them to talk to the Indianapolis City Council or School Board. What Jim Jones saw and he took from the black church, first was an aspect that he called entertainment. The white ministers would give their nice little 8-minute sermon and they'd have the hymns and everybody would be able to go home in an hour. At the black churches, the service might last 3 or 4 hours. This was social time. The ministers were fire and brimstone and entertaining. And the songs would be sometimes a lot of fun. They were hymns, but it had a lot of beats. You could get up and dance to it in a way that you couldn't for onward Christian soldiers. And he took these aspects. People's Temple, and by the way, People's does not have an apostrophe, because Jim Jones said apostrophes indicate ownership, and the church should belong to everybody. Jones would give 4-hour sermons, and he would touch on socialism. He might take a Bible and throw it down and stamp on it, but 10 minutes later he'd be picking up the Bible and quoting Scripture. The reason he did this was not everybody joined People's Temple for the same reasons. Some came for the religion. It was a comfort to them. They wanted to hear about the Bible. They wanted to hear about the Promised Land. Others came less for the religion than this is a church that can bring about social change. Now think what it must have been like in the 1950s. Not only are there black parishioners at People's Temple, but now some white people are joining. Younger white people who have social consciences. We can make a difference. We can change things. We can integrate Indianapolis. And if we do that, why can't we go to California and do it on a bigger scale? So you had some members that were there for the religion, and Jim Jones would sincerely direct himself to that. And you had many more who were there for the social justice. Jones would say later he never ever believed in God, that he just used the church to get himself noticed. But he said that in his last years when he was hooked on speed and other drugs, and completely ignored his childhood when he loved the church so much he joined 5 of them, when he would go preach on street corners when all he could get for it was a beating. So there is no simple question. You could find what you wanted if you were a member of the church. And you know I said he gave 4-hour sermons? Much like me coming here and boring the heck out of you. And he wouldn't allow bathroom breaks. For himself, behind the pulpit, he had a basin which he would discreetly relieve himself in, even as he was waving his arms.
That's what we have behind here, Jeff.
Yeah, I know, it was disgusting. Why do you think I'm standing here? And during his sermons, he would say all kinds of contradictory things. And you think, my God, the guy's raving, he's a lunatic. But then as I listened to the tapes over and over, I realized, in fact, there's works of genius there. Because during any Jim Jones sermon, every person who was in that audience heard something they agreed with. And so his congregation would figure, well, okay, so Jim doesn't really believe in the Bible, but we're doing these wonderful social things, I'll stay with him. Or Jim is really a Christian. He's doing some of these other social things for some of the other members of the church. Everybody was hearing a reason they should be part of his congregation. If you get a chance, now here's a stupid question. I'm a journalist, I ask lots of stupid questions. Any of you here use the internet much? I'd ask you to do this. Sometime in the next couple of days, would you go to a site called the Jonestown Institute? And the Jonestown Institute has tapes of some of Jim Jones's sermons online. Give them a listen. You will not have heard anything like this in your lives.
Yeah, the Jonestown Institute is an archive and research center, San Diego State University, right?
Since been moved to Seattle.
Oh, it's been moved to Seattle now. Okay.
But the thing about Jim Jones and People's Temple is they recorded everything. And so there is this record, and I hope some of you will listen to some of it. Sadly, they also recorded that last day when he's exhorting everybody to line up and die. And there's that to hear too.
Yeah, the tragic death tapes, which I've heard once and won't hear again. Let's talk about the downfall of Jim Jones. So he goes to, People's Temple goes to Northern California. They find a power base, a political base in San Francisco. They find the kind of adherents that allow them to grow the church, mostly in Los Angeles. A lot of black Los Angeles, Southern California folks. The temple grows. But Jim Jones, by the late 60s and in particular the 70s, this is an individual who appears absolutely consumed by conspiracy theories, conspiratorial paranoia, from the JFK, MLK, Robert Kennedy assassinations to Watergate. As you detail in your book, there's very little evidence that either the state or local governments of California or the federal government ever really sought to destroy the People's Temple or target Jones himself. There doesn't seem to be any evidence of this. In fact, the People's Temple was well connected to the political powers that be in San Francisco in particular. And yet, he was obsessed with the threat of government, with the threat of powers that were going to destroy the temple. Where do you think this obsession and paranoia comes from? Is this just demagoguery?
Every demagogue will sooner or later turn to conspiracy theories, the more outlandish the better, to bind his or her followers to them. Manson did this with conspiracy theories, talking about there's going to be a race war and all these things are going to happen. But follow me and you'll be protected and you'll end up ruling the world. He actually told his followers that helter-skelter, the race war is coming, and you've got two choices. You can leave the Manson family and you can go out there into the world and the black people are going to kill you. Or you can stay with me and be safe. Those are the choices. Jim Jones, to bind his followers to him, began talking about small conspiracy theories. We all know that the government is really just there for the white capitalists, and we have to be aware of this. And built that paranoia sermon by sermon, month by month, until he's telling his followers, we have to get out of America. They're going to have concentration camps for blacks. How is this possible, you say? Remember 10 years earlier, during World War II, Japanese Americans were put against their will into prison camps. He would tell his followers that black people are being shot down on the streets or lynched every day. In the 1960s, no, this is not happening. But his older members remember from the 1940s when it did happen on a regular basis. He's building up conspiracy theories, and he's trying to keep them from listening to any other outside sources but himself. And this is why Jonestown, in the middle of the second densest jungle on the planet and the most poisonous reptile-infested jungle on the planet, 150 miles from the nearest road. When he gets them over there, and they're working 7 days a week trying to cut down the jungle and build a farm, physically exhausted from labor. Anybody here ever work on a farm maybe in the summer or something? It's hard, isn't it? And if you can imagine doing it in a tropical jungle where the temperature is around 110 degrees, there's all kinds of bugs and snakes and the occasional clawed cat in the jungle. They don't have a whole lot of food. They've got to grow what they can. There's no protein. They don't have sources of meat, so people are weak. And Jones doesn't allow any contact with the outside world. All they can hear is him. And now the conspiracies get more desperate. The government of the United States has decided we need to be killed. We're setting this great example of how people can live. They hate us. They're going to come parachuting in. They're going to take our children and put them in foster homes where they will be raised as capitalists. We cannot allow this to happen. And he tells them this day after day. Now, you're all suffering because you've been sitting here for an hour and 15 minutes listening to me. Can you imagine if you've been working out in the jungle from 6 in the morning till 6 in the evening, fed scraps, you're so physically exhausted, and now for 3 or 4 hours you're going to sit in the pavilion at Jonestown, and I'm going to tell you all about the people who are coming to get you? Demagogues thrive on paranoia. They excel always at making people believe that anyone who's different than us is dangerous to us.
The Jonestown tragedy is so profound and huge. Nearly 1,000 people willingly, to some degree or another. You talk about this. I think one of the myths of this is that it's often called mass suicide, but it's probably more accurately mass murder.
Yes, very much so.
But over 1,000 people are killed in the jungles of Guyana, including the murder of hundreds of children. Simple question. What brings people to commit to support such heinous acts? Those who were armed guards. Right? How can we begin to understand something that just seemingly seems so impossible to understand?
Remember how we talked about coincidence and how it has god-awful results sometimes? Jim Jones, by the end, in Jonestown, much of the time is either a gibbering idiot or out cold from drugs. As his drug use grows, so does his paranoia. He gets more incoherent. But remember, the people who are in Jonestown, you're 150 miles away from safety. Jones has their passports. No one's allowed to have money. And he would tell them, if you want to go, go, but you got to get through the jungle. I nearly didn't make it, cutting my way through 2 miles of the jungle with a machete to get to Jonestown from a road that's there now. So you've got families. Anybody here have small children? Can you imagine dragging them through a jungle, trying to get away? He's got them. They can't leave. Now, Jones has, at this point, about 900 people in Jonestown, and I have talked to people who were there, including the one survivor of that terrible day. And the estimate I keep hearing is out of 900 people, 300 are children, from infants to toddlers. Well, you know, they don't think in terms of is Jones wrong or not. They're just there. Another 300 are old people in their 70s and 80s and even in their 90s. Jones wanted senior citizens to be part of Jonestown because their Social Security checks would be turned over to him, and that's where they would get their operating money. These old folks, if they tried to escape through the jungle, physically can't do it. They're there. So then we're left with about 300 people. The adults, the people your age, and they're exhausted, and they're hungry, and they're sick of all this crap. What are they going to do? We won't talk tonight about how a U.S. congressman decided to come in and take a look because he'd gotten complaints from some constituents that they had relatives being held against their will in Jonestown, because Jones reached a point of paranoia where he asked the camp doctor, a med school dropout because he's a drug addict, who Jones managed to get into a Mexican medical school. This guy became the doctor at Jonestown. And at one point, Jones told him to order a pound of poison, enough for 2,000 lethal doses. I found the sales receipt in the FBI file. $7. The doctor starts experimenting quietly. What amount of the drug will kill a pig? Jim's waiting to hear he's figured out the right dose. So it's not a matter of if at this point as far as Jones is concerned, it's a matter of when. He sees this as a final statement, something that is going to make the world remember him. He compares himself to the general of an army. He used to be the shepherd with his sheep, got to protect them. But now he's the leader of an army, and everyone knows that sometimes you have to sacrifice some of your soldiers, or all of them. He actually makes them practice this. He tells them, line up one night, here, drink a cup of this, they all drink it, then he tells them they've been poisoned, they're going to die in 45 minutes. Then, after they've all decided they're going to die and are panicking, he says, oh, no, that was just a test. You've proven you're good socialists, that you would face death bravely. His bodyguards, the guys carrying the guns, are mostly young men, including his sons, Stephen and Jimmy. They've got the guns, in theory, to form a barrier for when the American Army or CIA comes storming in to kill everybody. But in fact, they've got the guns because Jones is so paranoid. Jim Jones Jr. has become a very close friend of mine. We talk a lot. And in fact, when I make my closing statement, you'll be pleased to know that one is coming soon. I'm going to tell you what Jimmy wanted you to know tonight, because I asked him what I should tell you. But they had the guns. They decided Jones is crazy, and they are talking about removing him from power, that they might have to do this. And they start talking about who could run Jonestown, and decide that Jones's wife, Marceline, could do it. Stephen Jones, the oldest son, people would respect them. But coincidence. The guys at Jonestown like to play basketball. And the guys on the Jonestown basketball team just happened to be the security detail with all the guns. And at this same time a congressman is coming in, the Jonestown team is invited to come to Georgetown, the capital of Guyana, and play a couple exhibition games against the Guyanese national basketball team. And so the people who would have stood up to Jones are not in Jonestown, and he takes advantage of that. The people with the guns, he hands out the guns to his true believer followers who will do anything he tells them to do. And so the congressman comes and some things happen, and Jones decides this is only the beginning. He orders that the congressman be murdered, and he is. Then he tells everybody, look, that's it, we did it. It wasn't me. Some people who killed the congressman just did it on their own. I wasn't responsible. But now they're going to come, and this is what we have to do. Don't think of it as suicide. We're making a revolutionary gesture. If we do this, the world will remember us forever. And you can hear the tape. It's on the internet. He's called everybody into the pavilion. And the pavilion seated maybe 400 people. And everybody else is sort of crammed in the aisles. Tib Carter, last person surviving from Jonestown that day, who has become a friend of mine, goes to the pavilion when they're all called there with his wife and his 14-month-old son. Everybody's thinking, well, Jim's just going to talk and talk for a while. He's always said this stuff before, and then at the end he says, oh, well, go on back. They think that's what'll happen. Tim's wife says to him, you go on ahead. I'm going to stop and get some diapers for the baby because Jim's going to talk a long time. And so these people come, and they're exhausted, and they're hungry. And they just think Jim Jones is going to talk a while. And then he starts telling them about the killers who are going to be coming any minute, and we're going to do this thing. And then he says, bring out the syringes. You've heard all about the vats of poison drink, but they had the syringes first because he said it's only merciful to let the children die first. And he said, the poison here is just going to be like going to sleep. There's not going to be any pain at all. So bring the children up. Let's go. Line up. And some people don't want to. There are some that say, yes, Father, you're going to save us. But others, no, no. And they're the guns, and they're being pushed forward. And they start with the babies, and they have the syringes with the poison in it, and they shoot the poison in the babies' mouths. But a horrible thing happens. The babies begin convulsing and foaming at the mouth. It's not a peaceful death at all. It's horrible. It's cyanide poisoning. Any science majors here? What cyanide poison does is it restricts the body's ability to absorb oxygen. You basically suffocate, but you do it slowly over a matter of a couple minutes. And it's horrible the whole time. And people see this with the children. And on the tape, you can hear that they're screaming, what's going on, what's going on? And Jones is screaming, no, be brave socialists. It's not bad, it's just a little bitter tasting. And he brings out the vats. Everybody's supposed to walk up and dip their cup and drink it, and people don't want to. And you can hear on the tapes screaming and yelling and the guards hurting them. And some people are held down and forcibly injected with the poison if they won't drink it. And a lot of them are just so tired of everything. Fine, give me the poison, I'll take it. Let's let this be over. Tim Carter, the last survivor of Jonestown, is in the line with his wife and child. And the 14-month-old baby, Malcolm, is taken into the arms of one of Jones's women followers. The poison squirted in his mouth. Gloria Tim's wife, seeing her son dying, she's going to die too. If there's a heaven, she wants to go with him so she can be with him, and she drinks the poison. Goes into convulsions. It's Tim's turn. Somebody taps him on the shoulder. Jim's got a job for you. To take some money to the Russian embassy. You're going to have to get through the jungle. Don't know how you're going to do it, but do it. And he sees his wife and child. There's nothing he can do. He wants to die too, and he's thinking, somebody needs to tell what happened here today. It will be a terrible journey for Tim, who's captured by the Guianese soldiers, accused of mass murder, among other things. It took him years and years, finally back in the States. And then everything's quiet in Jonestown. There's been shooting, killing the congressman at the airstrip. Some people got away. Plane lands back in Georgetown. Pilots incoherently talking about shooting and mobs. The Guyanese government thinks Jonestown must be rising up, leading a revolt against them, but it's night in the jungle, they can't do anything, so they send a guy named Gerald Gouveia, an army pilot, in a plane at daybreak to come back and fly over and see what's happened and report back. And as he flies over Jonestown, he thinks to himself, they've got bundles of cloth all over the ground by the pavilion. And I know this because I flew into the same place with Gerald Gouveia, and he described it to me and took some pictures that are in the book. And he said, so he described this. They sent in soldiers, and the first report was that there were 400 people dead in Jonestown. And everybody knew there were 1,000 people living there. What happened to the other 600? Well, maybe they're out in the jungle armed and waiting to attack us. Then the next day, suddenly there's 700 people dead in Jonestown. That's because under the pile of adults, there's a layer of old people. And 2 days later, they finally announced that 908 people who died because there's a bottom layer, and it's the infants and the toddlers. And the world went insane writing about it and wondering, what does it mean? What does it mean? What it means, of course, is what Jim Jones Jr. wanted me to tell you, the message he would have. Jimmy's almost 60 now. He's had a couple strokes, walks with a cane. His pregnant wife died that day in Jonestown. Jimmy, of course, was with the basketball team. He's since remarried. And he said, the thing I should tell you is this. Always question. Never take anything at face value. The people who tell you they know what's best for you and don't listen to anybody else are the ones you cannot trust. Don't go into anything blindly, and if you think something is wrong, get away. Don't stay. He says now that he thinks maybe something good will come of it if people think about it enough. That People's Temple was supposed to set an example, and they have. Maybe not the example they expected. Jim Jones is not the first demagogue in our history. He won't be the last one. But the things he said and the things he did prove two things. First of all, that all demagogues do have certain traits. You can tell if you will look objectively. And the second thing is, you can't always assume that a demagogue has only done bad or evil things. That, to me, is the saddest thing about Jim Jones. It's horrible that innocent people died who did not have to die. It's also extremely sad that someone who had that great capacity for leadership and to do so much good ended up doing great evil instead. Because a lot of the times the demagogues don't know that's what they are. It ratchets up bit by bit by bit. For the students here tonight, you're being told right now in a lot of places that this is a terrible, sad time and all the world's going to hell and what's to become of America and you. But that's what everybody was telling me when I was in college in the 1960s. That's what everybody was telling your great-grandparents during the Depression. There are scary things out there. There are demagogues there. It's a hard world. But every one of you has the capacity to have a good life and an exciting life and accomplish things. Whatever you decide you want to do, never let anybody tell you you can't do something. Believe in yourselves. And if you believe in yourselves enough, like Jim Jones Jr. says, that's when you don't need a demagogue. Anybody have any questions? This nice depressing talk we've had? I also have written a book about Santa Claus. Please ask me back sometime and we'll talk Christmas stuff.
Hello. I've been, so I don't really know much about that period of time in American history, but O.J. Simpson and that trial.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think that influenced? I don't know. Is there any comparison between? Is O.J. Simpson a demagogue?
O.J. Simpson is proof that a lot of times we turn tragedy into entertainment, I think. I was actually out there in my newspaper covering some of that. O.J. didn't talk to us, but I spent quite a bit of time with Johnny Cochran and Mark Furman. And the funny thing was, they hated each other. And yet they both were very interesting, convincing guys in their way. O.J. was not a demagogue as such, but he does represent the danger of our celebrity culture. That people who are celebrities start getting the feeling they can do anything and get away with it, and they often do. So I don't think of him as a Jim Jones. I don't think of him even as a Charlie Manson, though I think O.J. and Charlie are both pretty creepy people. But I do think he's part of the celebrophilia that is part of America. I won't write a book about that because I'm not much on celebrities. I once had an interesting argument with, what's her name? Kardashian. Kim Kardashian. Sorry, I didn't know who she was when we were both on the radio show, and that seemed to offend her. So we discussed the America's facility for letting people be famous who haven't actually done anything. And she said I was comparing her to Charlie Manson. And I said, no, at least he did something, even though it was terrible. And the host of the show said that the switchboard lit up with all these 14-year-old girls calling about me being mean to Kim. And he asked me, did I have a phone number where they could reach me because the show was over. And I did a terribly cruel thing. When you're an author and you're out on tour, you have a publicist back at the publishing house who's arranging all your stuff. And I figured Maureen's a good sport. She won't mind. 3 a.m., my cell phone rings. It's Maureen. She said, I just got off the phone with the 2000th pissed off little girl. Can we agree that you will never utter the name Kim Kardashian in public again? And until this moment, I never did.
You heard it here first, folks.
Yeah, I was just wondering what you thought about the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and what they chose to do with that, with the ending and everything.
I like the movie because I admire good storytelling. The problem I have with movies like that, I think an even better example is the movie Bonnie and Clyde with Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway. You know, people see these movies and they are great entertainment. But they start thinking that what was in the movie is what actually happened. While I can enjoy the film on its own merits as storytelling, it bothers me a little that there's a lot of people who will read it and think, well, that's exactly what Sharon Tate was like, and that's the way it all went down. But again, show business, entertainment, you know, will take real topics and it will sort of change it around to fit what it thinks its audience wants. They did a 4-part TV miniseries on my Jones book, and I was a little bothered because I said, you need to concentrate more than you have on Indianapolis and all the great things he did there, you know, so that viewers would see the capacity he had for great leadership. They said, no, viewers want to get to Jonestown. They want the Kool-Aid. That's show business, I guess. I'm going to be leaving at 5 in the morning to drive all the way back down to Texas. I wish that some of these really sharp young people here, can I get 2 really good questions from you so I can feel like we've succeeded and it was a good night and I can drive that long, hard 10 hours smiling and happy? I'm looking at you, back row. Don't think you're sneaking out of here without a question. So talk among yourselves, figure one out. Yes, sir.
Do you think there's any distinct connection between serial killers and cult leaders in the United States and the mystique that often the population develops behind them?
Did you all hear that question over there? Connection between serial killers and cult leaders?
It is inevitable that one way or another, cult leaders eventually will lead their followers into some kind of disaster. Because cults are based on extreme emotions and beliefs, this means you've got people who are more prone to acting out some of their fears. It's not a given that all cults will end up with serial killing or some type of mass death, but it's all too familiar. And again, it's part of the culture of being a true believer. I will die for you, or the leader saying, will you die for me? You don't want to answer that question in the affirmative. Yes, sir.
All right. Well, I guess someone's going to ask the question. You think when we're talking about demigods or demigod,
Yeah.
is that what you said?
Yeah, demagogues, yeah.
And cults and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that in America today, we're focusing on political candidates as more of those demigods and cult leaders than actually people that can make a change in our society and lead us to a better place?
That's a good question. What's your name?
Andrew Erb, City Councilman Andrew Erb, actually.
Pleased to meet you. To an extent, all politicians have to be demagogues. They're trying to convince us you need to vote for me rather than the other guy, because if you vote for the other person, it's a disaster. You vote for me, we're all going to work together. I mean, that's part of political DNA. In some cases, let's face it, it gets overblown. Now, a lot of people think when I'm talking about demagogues, what I'm really trying to say is Donald Trump's a demagogue, and all these things are happening. Well, we've had outright demagogues in American politics throughout our history, and they've been members of both major parties. So what we're seeing today is not anything that's new. I'm thinking of writing my next book about a guy named Joe McCarthy and looking at back how in the early 1950s he used a new medium called television to get followers for his outspoken belief in the same way that politicians today are using social media more and more. So what I am saying is, yeah, there's demagogues in politics that get completely out of control. And when that happens, the country is split. It seems to be happening now. It has happened other times in our history. And again, both political parties. Don't ever get the idea that demagoguery is reserved for one or the other. Yeah, right now, the things that I learned in writing The Road to Jonestown scare the hell out of me when I think about some of the things happening in America today. But the comfort is, from my research, I know we've had these times before. We get through them. I just wish to hell that we would learn that some of these problems that keep coming up over and over and over again are going to keep coming up until we all sit down and work them out sensibly instead of yelling at each other. That's what I would wish. Back row, nobody leaves until one of those four. That's called peer pressure, gang.
Jeff, do you think that Jim Jones, he did all these great things, even in that, it was the A&E or the History Channel that did the terror of the... Okay, yes. Okay, that Rosalind Carter came to California and campaigned with him or something. Okay, but he did some good things.
Yeah.
Was it drugs? Was that made him go crazy? Was it his hunger for power? Was it a mix of both?
Yes.
Okay.
Jim Jones, like Charlie Manson, like Joe McCarthy, by other demagogues we shall not name, all ultimately are motivated by one thing above all others, and that is being powerful and in control. Drugs that Jones took exacerbated that. But remember, demagogues surround themselves with fawning people who will tell them you're wonderful and never disagree with them. All of us go through our lives, and if we're screwing up some way, somebody's going to bring us up short, right? A professor, a spouse, whatever. Demagogues don't have that. They've got this protective sort of group around them and say everything you say is wonderful. And that has a lot to do with it too.
I'm reading a book again. It's Lacey, Scott Peterson. And just what you said, he came from a family where his parents believed he was the youngest child out of 4. And his parents believed that Scott Peterson could do no wrong. And it's amazing to me. I mean, I'm a mom of 3 kids. He never would have gotten away with any of that, I'll tell you that. The other thing is I wanted to say was Doris Day's son,
Terry Melcher.
When he told his mother of having that experience with Charles Manson, that came over to his studio, and Charles Manson didn't get what he wanted, you know, he wasn't this great musician. His mother told Terry Melcher, sell your house. So listen to your mom.
That's good. Now, okay, we're getting the question from the
Yeah,
back.
Natalie?
No, okay, we'll go. Yes, yes, ma'am.
Natalie's
Yes.
been waiting.
Yes, you.
My question is, I assume you do a bunch of research just in your place before you actually go out and visit these places.
Mm-hmm.
Does everything click? Like when you first go to these places, do you just feel this immense, like this is where it all went down? Or what are your thoughts when you enter a place like that?
Every time I start a book, I'm scared spitless. I think this is going to be the one I can't figure out. I start doing paper and archival research first, so I'll know names and dates and so forth, and it just seems like a big hairy mess. I always think this is the book I'm not going to figure this out on. But then you start going to the places and seeing the things that the people you're writing about saw. I cannot imagine writing a book where I haven't gone everywhere that I'm writing about. And in every book, and your question's very perceptive, I always start the first third of the process. It takes about 3 years to research and write a book. And for the first year, I'm convinced I'm never going to figure this out. This is going to be a disaster. You know, I should tell the publisher, no, I can't do it. The second year, things start to seem familiar. I can see where some of the pieces fit together. And by the third year, you can see the whole process. You can see all the coincidence that's a factor, all the cultural factors. And that's when it starts to come together and you think, I hope it's a good book, but what's really important here is I've learned a lot. Whatever you guys do, whatever careers you go into, I urge you, do something that always makes you challenge yourself. It really is a wonderful feeling that, okay, I finished this, I know things now I didn't know before. And that means a lot. That was a good question. I sure appreciate it. Is there a good question in the back row? No pressure, but we're not leaving until...
Yeah, it's on your shoulders, Matthew.
Yeah. No pressure, we're all depending on you.
So with your history as a journalist and author, doing lots of research, you've had a lot of exposure to media and the cyclical nature of the demagoguery. Do you feel like now in today's atmosphere where everybody has a voice and everybody can reach a wider audience rather than just Jim Jones and all the people he could meet in Indiana or Los Angeles, or it's just a certain amount of reach?
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like there's a possibility for a greater amount of damage can be done by more people now as in the past, or do you feel like it's evens itself out?
Everybody, every older generation feels threatened by the next generation and whatever means they have of communicating their ideas. There were people in the 1920s and 30s who were convinced radio was the ruin of America. Because any fool can get on the radio and say any darn thing they want, and there's some idiots who'll be listening and believe them. And we survived radio. That happened again in the next generation with television. Suddenly you were there, you could see everything. And Spiro Agnew, anybody here remember Spiro? Vice President of the United States? Spiro claimed that the American newspaper system and TV system were dominated by 12 people who decided everything that was presented, and they were forcing their views on the American people. And we were all going to hell because of it. We didn't, but Spiro had to resign his office because he took bribes. I don't know many journalists who were sad. The internet worries me. Anybody can blog, anybody can claim conspiracy, and we see that there are some people who now have become semi-celebrities just sort of throwing out all these impossible conspiracy theories, but they're interesting to read, and as people said with radio, there's some fools who believe whatever's out there. But I do think this, if now there is more capacity for misinformation, there's also more chances to get the right information. More people, I think, will show sense in what they choose to read and believe than those who won't. The ones who won't may yell louder. I can complain about the internet all I want, and I don't do my research really via the internet. I will go to archives, I will go to places. But I sure don't complain about the internet when I'm trying to do interviews online with different people. I don't complain about the internet when I am communicating with scholars in other countries, trying to get information. There's no media outlet that's perfect. But the internet has opened up a lot of opportunities, and let's face it, it is now the way people get most of their information. We can like it or not, but it's just a fact. And I may worry about it, but I'm still more in favor than not. See, now these are the kinds of questions. Can't get this in Texas. I'm sorry to say. You know, some Texas schools, the school motto is, several of us can read. And then you come to this school and you meet people, students who are smart. I'm going to go back home smiling. I gave Jay a box of some of my books. I think there's a few laying around if any of you decide you want to read one.
Yeah, if you're interested in the Road to Jonestown book, I have several copies in my office. I'm on the 3rd floor of Rarick. You can find me. Many of you know who I am. I'll pass off a book to you. I think that, this was a success because what I was hoping would, and the reason why I reached out to you, Jeff, is to bring you here and talk about cultural memory and to talk, I think, have a difficult at times conversation. Some of what you had said, the detail you had said about the Jonestown tragedy, hard to listen to, but so important to confront. It's like the memory of the Holocaust. Many people have said, are worried that those who are alive here on earth that have a memory of the Holocaust, there are very few of them left. And what happens after all of those people pass on? What do we do about cultural memory? How do we keep it alive? And how do we turn history into a lesson about how to live better and how to be better connected to each other, and how to bring about things like prosperity and peace and love. And that's why I brought you out here. And I really appreciate it. Jeff Guinn, let's give him a hand. Thanks for coming out, Jeff. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Cheers. Thank you very much. And come meet with me or contact with me if you want to reach out to Jeff or if you want one of his books. Thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it. It's nice to see some new faces, those who I don't know as well as those I do. Have a great night, folks. Thank you.